Hello and welcome to another video review. This is the expansion packs for Quake, aka Quake 2 Mission Pack The Reckoning and Quake 2 Mission Pack Ground Zero for PC. At first I was going to review these separately, but then the more I played them, the more I realized that they're pretty much required to be in the same review together. So here you go. The first of these mission packs was The Reckoning, which was released on May 30th of 1998, and it was developed by Xatrix Entertainment, which you'd probably better know as Gray Matter Interactive, or by what they merged into, Treyarch. They're now responsible for Call of Duty games, at least mostly Call of Duty games. And the other one was Ground Zero, which was released on August 31st of 1998, and it was developed by Rogue Entertainment. And they developed also, if you've ever heard of Strife or American McGee's Alice, they also made both of those. But they're actually two very different expansion packs in just the way they feel, because one is certainly radically different from the other. And so that provides an interesting bit of variety to these expansion packs. But since they are expansions, they use the same graphics as the original game. They use a lot of the same sound effects and music as well. So I'm not going to really talk about that. They did add in a couple new music tracks for the new expansions, and they're up to par with what the original game had. They're just not quite as high quality. Still, they're pretty good. As for the new sound effects that they added in for certain new items in the expansion packs, they did a decent job. But for the most part, everything's pretty much the same. But I'm going to talk mostly about the gameplay differences, and, well, there's not really much story difference either, but mostly gameplay differences between these two expansions. So let's start with the first of these two expansion packs, which is The Reckoning. Now, it is a very, very similar storyline to that of Quake II. You're still fighting the Strogg, you're still trying to basically save humanity from fighting them. All I really noticed that was different was that you're fighting on a different planet. At least I think you are, I'm not really sure. It's kind of hard to tell in the opening cutscene because the sound quality is just kind of garbled in that particular bit. And the new voice acting they threw in there was just so garbled that sometimes you can barely understand what people are saying. Whereas in the original Quake 2, it was actually pretty clear, and you knew what you were doing. It actually told you. But since I don't have a manual for this thing, and I don't have the game box for it, I don't really know where I am or what my ultimate objective is. I just know I'm playing a Quake 2 expansion. That's basically all you get with the storyline in this one. Unless you had the manual or the game box with you, you really don't know what you're getting into unless you just play it. Which is fine. I mean, it's Quake 2. You can generally get away with that in a first-person shooter. It's not like that's a really big problem, especially a Quake game where the story doesn't really matter. But suffice to say, the story got a little bit weird because I couldn't really tell what was going on. I'm like, where am I? What am I fighting? What are these new things? What Gek? What are Gek? And that sort of thing. So there was a little bit of confusion there, but it really didn't matter in the long run because I'm just like, okay, screw it, it's Quake. Just play it. And, much to my delight, the expansion pack, The Reckoning, is very much a continuation of Quake 2. It really does feel very much the same. It keeps that very fast-paced action, the solid level design. They added in a few new little bits and pieces to give you a little bit of creativity in here and there, namely in how you get from one place to another. There's also a little bit less backtracking, I guess you could say. And at one particular point in the game, they actually have it to where you basically have to backtrack all the way through, and then you go to a new area, and it just goes from there. So they do a little bit of a cool switch on the level design. There's a lot more flora and fauna now, because you're on a different place. There's these new things called the Gek, which I can't really tell what they are because the graphics are kind of hard to sift through, but they bleed yellow, I know that. And it's kind of a cool little variation from the very industrial stuff we saw in the original Quake 2. That said, this kind of new flora and fauna stuff is a little bit few and far between, which, I mean, it helps to break up the monotony, but still, they could have done a little bit more of that and really shown off the engine a little more. As for the gameplay itself, what can I say? It's Quake 2. They didn't really do anything to detract from the Quake II formula. In fact, they only added to it. Namely, they added in a few new weapons. The most awesome of these being the Phalanx, which is basically... it shoots these two exploding thingies. I'm not really sure what they're supposed to be. It says they're mag slugs, but I'm not really sure what they are. They shoot out and they explode. That's all you need to know. It's pretty cool, actually. And it does a pretty decent amount of damage, and they did a good job of making these weapons fairly usable, and especially where you get them in the game. The problem I had was that certain weapons that were in the original Quake II are just more useful than these new weapons. Like the Phalanx, for instance. While it does have its uses, it's really no better or worse than, say, the rocket launcher, or something like, I guess, the grenade launcher. And the Ion Blaster you get, it's the Ion Ripper, actually, I think. It bounces off walls, which is kind of cool, but when you're fighting in a lot of tight, confined areas, which this one does have more of than the original Quake, Quake II, I mean, it does become a little bit of a problem. That said, I'd say overall, this expansion pack is pretty solid, especially if you were played through Quake II and really hunkering for more. It's like, I need more Quake II. Oh, look, the Reckoning! So overall, I'd say Quake II: The Reckoning is worth it for the big Quake II fans. As for Ground Zero, that's another story entirely. Now, where The Reckoning was very much like the original Quake II, and it tried to be as close as possible to it, but keep it in the same setting, Ground Zero does something very different. It keeps the setting from the original Quake II. It's still on Strogos. And it changes up your objectives from just destroy Strog infrastructure to destroy the gravity well and free your comrades. And in this one, they kept the same setting, but they changed up the level design very much considerably. They also added in some new equipment and some new enemies to fight and fight with, obviously, if you're talking about the weapons. The new weapons, though, are not particularly useful. They're actually kind of underpowered compared to everything else that you get in the original Quake II. Whereas in The Reckoning, they actually had their uses, and they were kind of cool and unique. Whereas in this one, they're just not that impressive. I mean, it's stuff like a chainsaw and a prox mine launcher. I mean, that kind of stuff isn't that impressive. We don't really care. But it's, and especially the prox launcher, because proximity mines can get really annoying when you throw them wrong and you end up having to step on them and blow yourself up all the time. And here's another thing. The level design in Ground Zero is not quite as open as it was in Quake II and The Reckoning. There are moments where there's some wide open areas, sure, but there's a lot more tight corridors. So you'll be doing a lot more corridor shooting, and you'll also be doing a lot more backtracking and trying to find your way through the levels. They're a lot more labyrinthine than the original Quake II and The Reckoning were, which lengthens out the gameplay, even though this is actually a shorter campaign than The Reckoning, which was 18 levels. This one is 14 levels. But, like I said, they're more labyrinthine, and there's a lot more backtracking involved. So you'll end up actually feeling like it's a lot longer, which is kind of bad, actually, because there are certain moments of the Ground Zero expansion where it just devolves into tedium. It's like, oh great, now I gotta go all the way back here, and there's nothing in between where the area you just were was and the area you need to go is. There's just nothing in between there because you've already slaughtered all the enemies there. And sometimes they'll put enemies in your way again, and you'll know where you need to go from that. But it's not quite as obvious as it was in the original Quake II and The Reckoning, which makes the level design not quite as effective and not quite as fun to play through. And then, of course, you combine that with the new equipment, which just isn't all that impressive, and you have a pretty lackluster expansion pack. I mean, I know both of these things added in multiplayer features, but I can't really speak from that because, well, it's Quake II, and yeah. And I didn't really play the multiplayer because I consider Quake II to be a primarily single-player title. And like I said in my Quake II review, I've only managed to get the multiplayer for Quake II working once. And that one time I was playing over LAN, and it was decent deathmatch, but that was kind of all I knew about it. So, Ground Zero is more of a multiplayer expansion than it is a single-player expansion, I've noticed. I don't really like the Ground Zero expansion because it just doesn't feel like Quake II. It feels like sort of like the expansion packs for the original Quake. They just kind of felt out of place and just distant from what the original was so great at. I mean, there are moments in Ground Zero where it's actually good, but it just doesn't feel quite up to par with Quake 2 and The Reckoning. Because The Reckoning kind of felt like a natural extension, whereas this one just kind of feels like a tacked-on bit just to make extra money. So out of these two expansion packs, the only one I can recommend without a shadow of a doubt is The Reckoning. And Ground Zero, unless you're like a really hardcore fan, stay away from it. So that's overall how you're going to go with this. Reckoning, good. Ground Zero, not very good. Only get it if you're a hardcore fan. So there you go, folks. Thanks for watching.